Hi there, my name is Will and welcome back to a deep dive of workflow components. Today we're going to be looking at execution and all the ways that you can execute your flows in Kestra. Jumping into Kestra, we can actually execute our flows by pressing execute in the top right hand corner. And when I press execute, it's going to prompt us to input any of our inputs that don't already have default values, or if we want to edit those default values as well. We can also see an advanced configuration as well if we want to add any labels too. This is super useful if you want to be able to go back and see certain executions in the logs if you're trying to debug something. And simply, if I press execute, it's going to present a Gantt chart to us that's going to show us all the different tasks so we can see how long they took and in which order, as well as being able to view the logs produced from them. So we can see that this one has simply produced a hello log. We can also see the topology and see how long it took to execute things as well. Any outputs generated, metrics as well. Super useful if you want to be able to view all this information, and we can see the labels generated as well. If you want to view those executions, you can head over to the execution tab, and this is where you can see any of the flows executed. Super useful if you want to go back and be able to view outcomes from certain ones as well. On top of using the execute button in the user interface, there are a number of different ways that you can execute your flows as well. Jumping back into our example, this one is using a trigger. We're going to have a separate episode on triggers, but you can see here at the bottom and in the topology view that there is a trigger that is going to execute this on the first day of the month at 9 a.m. So that's one way you can automate your flows, but you can also execute them by using the Kestra API. Let's have a look at what that might look like. So in this example here, I have a very simple task set up that's going to make a HTTP request, and then it's going to print that out. Now, I'm going to want to be able to trigger this flow using the API. I can do that by using a client such as Postman or curl to be able to trigger it. Let's have a look at that. Inside of Postman, I can simply put the URL of our Kestra instance /API/v1 and then simply executions and then the name of our namespace, which in this case is also executions, and then the name of our flow, this being the ID. If I make this request, it will then come back and tell us that the request was made. And if we jump back into Kestra, we can also see that this was made. And as we can see in Kestra, we've had a new execution to the API, and I can click in that one and see that it was in fact executed successfully. And I can go in there and see all of the things that I would want to see about it, such as the logs of that execution as well. On top of that, you can also use webhooks to trigger executions in Kestra as well. In this example, I have set up a simple webhook trigger and I've added a little key here. So this is useful if you want to be able to trigger flows to run in Kestra, but you want to be able to add a little bit of authentication to stop anyone from being able to trigger them. Let's have a look in Postman of how we would set this off. Jumping into Postman, very similar to using the API, I can add in the part here of webhook, followed by our namespace, the flow ID, and then the key as well. So when I execute this, we can see that again, it executes. And if I jump back into Kestra, we can also see that this was executed successfully. I can see it was executed there. And if I jump into that execution ID, I can see the logs as we would expect. We can also execute our flows directly from Kestra. Using the Kestra Python library, we can actually trigger them as well. This uses the API under the hood, but this wrapper makes it a little bit easier to use. I have an example here that's going to simply run our HTTP request as well as log, and so let's trigger that using a Python script. So this Python example I have here is going to run a simple script that is going to use the Kestra library, and then it is going to create a flow class. Once it has created that object, it's going to use the execute method with our namespace executions with the flow ID Python. So if I execute our Python execution one here, we'll see that this is going to then execute. If I head over to the executions, we can see that it actually triggers the Python flow as well. So we can see that they work back to back and they are both successful. Last example I'm going to show is a ForEachItem execution trigger. So this is going to trigger a subflow. So this is really useful if you want to be able to organize your flows a little bit separately. This example is going to get a load of data, and then it is going to go through each data one at a time in the subflow and execute it. And let's have a look at that subflow as well. The subflow looks a little bit like this, and it's simply going to just concatenate the outputs into the shell so we can see very easily, and then it's going to print out what it gets there as well. So let's go back into our original flow, execute that, and have a look at the output. We can see from the Gantt chart that it executed them all 100 of them back to back as a separate flow. So this is super useful if you want to batch stuff together. As we can see here, it executed all of those back to back. And if I go to the execution tabs, we can see there is a lot of executions of our subflow. Instead of having it all under one flow, breaking it into separate ones so it's easier to manage the executions of. Let us know what you think in the comments below, and if you haven't already, join our Slack community where you can chat with us there.